Okay, welcome everybody to this CPD session, CPD Me session, in which we're going to explore the nature of the challenging encounter. And for those of you who haven't been involved in any of my previous webinars, I just want to emphasize the fact that my focus here is on the social encounters rather than the clinical encounters. I'm a non-clinical medical educator, and my particular interest is in the way in which individuals and groups function and gain the best out of the circumstances they find themselves in. And this particular webinar this evening is somewhat of a novelty in some respects, in that it's a brief introduction to a particular approach to solving problems called action science. And what I'm hoping that tonight's webinar will lead to is a trial short course where a number of you will take advantage of the opportunity of trying out action science in their own lives and professional practices, and look for ways, in fact, that we might then pursue that on a more regular basis by providing the opportunity for people to use this particular approach to problem solving that has been so powerful as an intervention. So essentially what we're looking to do during the course of the evening is to identify the nature of the challenge of us functioning together in small groups, to look at the who, the where and the when that these challenges actually arise, and to look at the potential impact, often negative impact, in fact, of ineffective communication. And what I'm hoping to then explore in a little bit of detail is how we can look at developing effective responses, which is the whole purpose of the course that we're going to try and demonstrate. So theoretically, the origins of tonight's exploration is that we're going to look a little bit at group dynamics and how they actually impact on our particularly non-technical skills in a whole variety of professional settings, but including all of the clinical settings that you find yourselves in. Then to look at a micro solution to these problems and challenges that action sciences actually represents, and to look for ways in which we can provide opportunities to resolve some of the issues that can emerge from our day-to-day interactions. So the first question that I want you to have a think about is what actually goes on in groups. Those of you who've attended my previous webinars on group dynamics will recognize that it's it's a particular interest of mine, and B, it's the nature of the way in which we're working in the professional environments that we find ourselves in a whole variety of different settings. And essentially, they're complex. And the more people there are in the group, the more complexity there is in the group. And that applies as much to formal groups as it does to informal groups, to professional settings, to interprofessional settings, and a whole range of other communities. The minute that two or more people find themselves in contact with one another, with a shared set of concerns and interests, you begin to identify characteristic features how groups can function, and in some respects, more often than not, dysfunction. So the way I'm going to introduce this to you is to show you a short extract from something that's become very, very popular in recent days. But this is an earlier manifestation of a version of this particular program. It's taken from the BBC's Line of Duty, and this is from episode 3. And I just want you to enjoy this particular episode. But while you're watching it, have a think about the way in which the group that find themselves together in this situation function, both at the sort of organisational level, but also at the interactional level. Environment that group found themselves in there, not only from the point of view of the actual event itself, the chase and the shooting of that particular character, but the challenge associated with the way in which that relatively small group can function within while in a particularly sort of risky environment, but also sort of demonstrating some of the challenges associated with the way in which groups function. One of the sources of, I think, particularly inspiring ways of thinking about groups arose from the work of this chap here, Wilfred Bion, who was a psychiatrist and psychotherapist who was partly responsible for the development of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in the early 1950s. But his experiences working in a military hospital in 1940s with soldiers who were suffering from degrees of resistance to normal military structures led him to theorize about different ways in which people come together in groups and actually manage to function. And the basis of his thinking about these was that it can be represented in a 2x2 matrix that reflects low and high levels of relevance and low and high levels of participation or engagement. And I just want to spend a little bit of a diversion on this, because I think it reflects some of the challenges associated with the way in which groups can work when they're being efficient and when they're being less efficient. And I think that one of the things that Bion would argue is that much of the time that people are actually engaged in group activity, there are things that actually get in the way of that efficiency manifesting itself very readily. And I'd be interested in your thoughts about this as we go through the evening. So looking first at issues of high relevance, but relatively low levels of participation, there's the notion of dependency. And dependence is the state when the leader is thought to be omnipotent and the led are thought to be inadequate. And this is a classic authoritarian environment, including, I've got to say, many educational environments where the assumption is the teacher knows something and the taught are waiting to be taught that particular component. So it's a very commonplace group environment is that of dependence, but it's not one necessarily that is the most effective and the most efficient for all of the participants. I'm sure you all recognize the situation in a typical classroom. If you think back to your school days, you're conscious of the fact that among your 20 or so fellow pupils in class, some of them were highly engaged in the process of fulfilling the task. Some were less so, wanting to spend time chatting to their friends and neighbours, and some were not only not engaged, but quite hostile to the task, but nevertheless were still sort of locked into that physical space in the presence of the person of whom they were dependent on. And that's just one example of the way in which dependency manifests itself in small group setting. When we look at lower levels of relevance, particularly in terms of the way in which the task is perceived by participants in the group, and still low levels of participation, we've got what Bion borrowed from physical behaviours of flight fight. And this is a situation where participants are hostile or aggressive, although not necessarily overt, and there is a definite situation where people are avoiding the task, either by dismissing it and diminishing it, which is the fight element, or running away from it and task avoiding, which is the flight component of that particular pair of ingredients. The third one represents high levels of participation, but still low relevance. And this is something that Bion called pairing. And pairing is a situation within which the group becomes fascinated by the particular engagement of two members. And it's an overtly psychotherapeutic interpretation based on the notion of the group having internal desire for a new leader to emerge from that pairing that they become dependent on. And this might be a situation that you recognize when you get two very powerful dominant personalities in a group who begin to sort of dominate the proceedings at the expense of possibly fulfilling the task. And the audience is quite fascinated by that process because they're looking to see what the outcome is that will perhaps move towards solving the problem that has been presented by the task itself. And the fourth situation that that people can find themselves in the group environment is that of work. And work is when you've got equal participation by all parties, all of whom are fully engaged in the process of addressing the concerns that have been presented, and they're actively collaborating with one another in order to achieve the task. And I'd like you to just reflect briefly on your typical day-to-day experiences of working in group environments, and ask yourself the question, do you find yourself most often in the work situation, or is it not infrequent that you find yourself engaging in one or more of these phenomena that are being called basic assumptions? I've got to emphasize that these are not when Byrne was using these descriptions, he wasn't being critical of people in the sense of saying they shouldn't do it, because all of these particular basic assumptions have a purpose. They do actually serve a function of allowing certain things to happen that enable, in some respects, the sort of the approach to work. So I don't want to suggest to you that these are undesirable behaviors. It's just that they're not necessarily the most effective way in which the whole of a group can become engaged in the management and effective management of the whole of a task. And the other reality that I think I'd like to emphasize is the fact that groups move in and out of these basic assumptions and work phases, and that work itself can be quite exhausting. And from time to time, you want a pair to look as if they're going to produce a quick solution. And from time to time, you might drift off and gaze out of the window, or have a brief conversation with your next door neighbor, or dare I say, pick up your phone to find out what's going on social media. So these are all challenges to group performance in many respects. And when we're thinking about the way in which groups function, we need to pay attention to some of these particular issues. I want now to just briefly point you in the direction of a sort of short vignette, and just have a quick read of this. And I'd be very interested in seeing any responses to your thoughts about this particular process. If you are able to make brief contributions to the chat space. So just have a quick read, a think, and I'll give you a minute or so to possibly begin to present some thoughts in the chat box. Andy, I've lost my view of chat box. Can you remind me how I can get back to it? Hello?
Hi, Mike. Yes, so it should be, if you just minimize your screen, you should be able to see it. You can click on the icons at the bottom and that should pop up for you. You might need to just rearrange your window a little bit. So where the presenter bar is, it should just be sat in there.
Okay, cheers, thanks. Okay, so it's an interesting challenge, isn't it? You've got that sort of situation that is possibly a little bit less of a commonplace nowadays in some communities, but we don't have to look too far around and about to possibly identify it. In fact, there was a situation not very long ago. A group of police from one of the southern police districts down in the UK, down in England, were sacked for as a consequence of their quite literally engaging explicitly in this sort of behaviour. The issue that I think is particularly notable here in this vignette is the fact that people may think something, but may not necessarily say something. And I think it's interesting to recognise the fact that some people are increasingly likely to say and pass observations. And I'd be interested if people could possibly illustrate what they might be saying about something if that situation were to arise. I'll give some room for that discussion for a little later when we've had an opportunity for you to type them in and for us to have a chance to read. Okay, so moving to the potential solutions to this particular issue is action science. And action science was a development arising from the work of academics in the United States in the 1990s, notably Chris Argyris and his colleagues. And essentially, action science is a tool that is designed to enable people to be self-reflective and challenging about their own contributions towards, in most respects, ineffective communication situations. And it's premised on a number of assumptions about the way in which people actually behave and how people function. And these include the fact that the human mind, they argue, is limited. We've got a very limited capacity for speed of thinking in some respects. And I think that that was illustrated very powerfully in the video extract that I showed you earlier on, that despite the fact that it was fairly obvious that Danny's team were recognizing that the behaviors that he were manifesting were not appropriate, they weren't quick enough to come up with approaches and interventions that would stop him from doing what he was doing. They were locked into professional hierarchies, for example, because quite clearly he was their boss. They were locked into the sort of patterns of thought processes that were determined by things like protocols. So, for example, one of the things that you might have been aware of is that when the vehicle stopped, Danny was the first out of his vehicle, and he immediately chased after the criminal that they were chasing. And what did the others do? They followed the protocol of going to get their second weapon out of the boot of the van. And that effectively slowed them down to the sort of 30 seconds or so that accounted for the period of time during which Danny confronted the person being chased and actually made the decision, in the absence of anybody else being there, to shoot him. So that's the basis of the limitation I'm describing here. I'm not talking about cognitive issues here. I'm talking about our capacity to, if you like, think sufficiently quickly and bring into bear all of the things that contribute towards the decision-making process: the formal, the informal, the group-based, and so on and so on. Our assumptions encourage us to focus on some things and not others. And what I just used as an example is a great illustration of that, the fact that they focused on the protocol in terms of the second weapon. that encourages us to draw particular conclusions about particular decisions about our next steps, for example. And the other issue is that it confuses, or it has the capacity to confuse inferences and facts. And this is a very, very interesting challenge, I think, this particular final definition here, about what we actually talk about in terms of our perceptions of reality. If we know something is definitely the case, we might argue that that's a fact. But as the last 4 years in American politics has described, there are all sorts of different ways of interpreting what is fact and what is not fact. And the whole notion of alternative fact, I suppose, is embraced by the notion of inference. And inferences are assumptions that we make based on our perceptions. And the fact is that our perceptions, by virtue of what we see and what we hear, can be impacted on by a whole range of other different things, including our values that we subscribe to and a whole range of other very, very abstract concepts, really. So in acknowledging the fact that those assumptions are true, what we need to have is a mechanism by which we can begin to address some of the issues. Just to illustrate some of these limitations, I've got two drawings that I'm sure you're all familiar with from a variety of different contexts. So in the drawing on the bottom left-hand side, you've got that classic image that can be interpreted either as an old lady in a scarf or a young woman looking away with some sort of hat on her head. Two quite distinct possible interpretations of the same bit of data. And it's very difficult to, once you've seen one interpretation, to swap to seeing the other interpretation. And similarly, I need probably to move these out of the way. We have this elephant with a strange collection of legs or not legs, depending on which perspective you want to put onto it. And the fact is that, again, we have what seems to be at first sight a very straightforward bit of data, and actually it's much more complicated than that. And there's a whole range of other similar still drawings that you can come across in terms of the way in which we can be deceived by what we think we see. And there's a whole range also of video examples, the best of which I think is probably the gorilla that appears in a basketball game. And you can, those of you who've seen it will recognize the fact that you can actually watch that video without seeing the gorilla. And another example of from a professor of psychology from one of the Southern universities who demonstrates some card games, but also is in the process of illustrating the fact that visual representations of what's going on in that particular short video can be changed quite dramatically without anybody actually recognizing it. And this brings us back to where Donald Schoen and Chris Argyris come from, by emphasizing these deficiencies that we work on, that we have distorted recall, and there's dozens of psychiatric psychological experiments that demonstrate that our incapacity to accurately recall events. I'll give you an example of that from my own personal experience very, very recently. We were trapped in our home relatively recently, and we became aware of an old lady walking up the street. She was dressed quite distinctly, and she looked a little bit lost and a little bit confused. And she ambled around for a little while and then disappeared and then reappeared. And on her reappearance, we decided that we really needed to do something about it. And my wife went out and had a brief conversation with her. And that did, in fact, confirm the fact that she was a little bit confused, a little bit uncertain. So in order to make sure that this lady was safe, we contacted the police, thinking that was the only thing that we could actually do. And on trying to respond appropriately to their questions, we realized we couldn't actually describe what she was dressed like. The only thing that we could significantly remember was this sort of quite distinctive hat that she was wearing. And they were saying to us, well, what coloured coat did she have? Was she carrying anything? And our capacity to recall that event, even though we'd been paying quite a lot of attention to it, was severely distorted by our lack of attention to those sorts of details. And that's just an example of the sorts of situations that people can find themselves in from time to time. We also have this tendency, as described before, of working from inferences rather than data. And then we come to two other sort of slightly more unhelpful characteristic behaviors in some respects in terms of our then response to them. And this is what Donald Schoen and Chris Argyris described as being self-protecting and self-sealing. And what these definitions are all about is that once we've made a decision in a particular direction, we actually protect that interpretation and close it to representations from anywhere else. So people find it very difficult to challenge the assumptions that have been identified, articulated, spelled out in a particular sort of way and presented to third parties. It's like publicly changing your mind in a sense, and people find that quite hard to do. So where do we go from here? Well, what action science hopes to be able to provide us with is the capacity to recognize the distinction between what Argyris and Schoen called espoused theory, which they gloss as what we intend and how we see ourselves, and theory in use. And theory in use is what we do and how others see us. And that is about the way in which the same events, in a sense, are represented. So in this conversation that we're having here tonight on this webinar, I've got an espoused theory about what I intend to do and how I see myself being represented by the case that I'm making. And in practical terms, the theory in use that I am working within is the way in which I'm actually talking to you this evening. I'm conscious from time to time of hesitations and repetitions and misspeaks and so on, and that converts itself into the way in which other people see and hear what it is that I'm saying. So part of the process of action science is to look for ways in which we can actually bring the espoused theory and the theory in use closer together, so that the intentions that we have in our espoused theory and the way in which we see ourselves, which hopefully is positive and direct, is represented by how other people see us. Okay. So an example of this is Einstein saying, "What are you thinking?" And what you might be thinking in response to what I've been saying so far is, "You're crazy, we can't do that." But on the actual verbalization, what comes out of the mouths of the person is, "Sure, no problem." And that, I think, is probably one of the most common representations of the sorts of errors that emerge in a whole variety of conversations, where you probably saying to yourself after the event, "I really wish I'd said that." What was the opportunity? What was the point in the conversation that was going on between Danny and his team of armed police officers when things were going wrong? When they were saying, no, you can't, or whatever, and him just overriding it by forcing a particular sort of issue, and then them going along with it. And the example of that was the whether they should actually fire their weapons, and the fact that despite initially saying they weren't going to do that, one non-verbally, subsequent high levels of pressure, both verbal and physical, turns the behavior around into it being a version of "sure, no problem," and non-verbally the order to the second police officer actually had the same outcome. And in terms of the behaviour of the third police officer in that particular example, you had an excuse that was identified not by the person themselves, but by the person in the leadership role who was articulating a view of what had happened that for that particular brief moment, at least, he went along with. So it's the manifestation then of what we think and how we're responding to a particular session and what we say that possibly enables incorrect and inappropriate responses to the situation. Now, quite clearly in clinical situations, you can see how that can have really quite serious outcomes. And obviously that is, there are strategies that have emerged from the development of non-technical skills, particularly around responses like PACE, for example, that are designed to avoid that sort of situation. But I'm talking about the sorts of things that happen on a more day-to-day basis, as well as those. So what action science is in the business of doing, to a certain extent, is making a decision to make the invisible visible. The sorts of things that are going on in people's heads actually becoming something that people can actually say. So we're moving from the private dialogue, what I thought and felt but did not say, to the public dialogue of what I and others actually said. And when it becomes public dialogue as opposed to private dialogue, you've actually got something that can be subsequently interrogated for a whole variety of purposes. Just back briefly to the sorts of misapprehensions that people can have of the same events and thereby influence their approaches. And I'm sure you've all seen this particular interpretation of the elephant. And you blindfold 5 individuals and you give them a part of the envelope, the elephant to investigate. And instead of trunk, they come up with a sharp pencil point. Instead of a trunk, they come up with a snake. Instead of the ears, it's curtains, and so on and so on. So the fact is that our partial interpretation of events don't help sometimes to give us the bigger picture. And what these 6 blindfolded people need to do is obviously first take off their blindfolds, but in the absence of that, communicating what they're experiencing and bringing them together in a way that represents, in a sense, some of the challenges associated with that representation of that experience. So vignette 2 just have a little bit of a change in pace and a change in focus. Have a quick read of this. So I think in this case, and if you feel you've got time to write a response, I think what we've got here is a situation where almost by definition, you're in a different situation. And I wonder what people think that different situation is represented by in this little vignette. Perhaps rather than considering what you would do, think about what's the nature of the social context within which this little vignette is set that would enable you to behave perhaps differently to possibly the example that we saw earlier on. Okay, so lots of people writing about finding out more, investigating, reassuring, discussing, collaborating. Somebody wrote that there was a moral duty to investigate. So there's a whole range of responses that you'll all be able to have a closer look at as we pass our way down further into the webinar. The fact is that there are quite clearly implications that you would need to address this with a group of students without any hesitation. The the fact that it's a group of students gives you real opportunities to have the position where you can represent that particular point of view, because of the implications of hierarchy that the nature of the student and the professional interaction will actually enable, regardless of the consequences of that. And it's almost a sort of, as somebody did actually say, it's a moral obligation to actually pursue the issues that have arisen from this particular setting, because you have real implications for their future, the future ways in which they can actually engage with with patients. Okay. So what action science, in a brief representation of how action science actually functions, I'm just going to go through this particular representation here in this diagram as we move towards the final slides and an opportunity to ask questions. Essentially, we're starting at 1 o'clock here of seeking alternative views and data. And I think that the fact is that if you sat down the 4 people who participated in that event in the brief extract from Line of Duty, you are going to recognize the fact that there are going to be different views and different interpretations of what actually happened. I think that almost certainly you would have an expectation, if you were the person responsible for collecting data about that event, that if people were sort of cornered on their own without the opportunity to spend any time together, you would get different interpretations and different accounts of what actually happened. And this is a classic example of the whole issue around the fact that we're working from inference rather than data. Our capacity to accurately recall and prioritize the circumstances that have arisen from our participation in events of a variety of situations almost invariably lead to these alternative views and alternative sources of data. There's a responsibility to probe people's views by examination and through questioning in an attempt to clarify perhaps some of the distinctions that people have represented and the priorities that people have illustrated in their previous exploration. You want to challenge a variety of different responses, and I summed up brilliantly by this little this badge apparently that was worn by somebody. The worst part of censorship is, and of course it's brilliantly censored, but that whole notion of people in circumstances where things are have not worked out particularly well have got a really strong inducement for themselves to avoid telling the whole of the story. They don't want necessarily to represent every aspect of it to possibly misrepresent their intentions, but and their outcomes. The whole notion of groupthink is a very interesting challenge. It's a psychological theory that emerged in the 1960s, I think, and it illustrated brilliantly by this cartoon here, where you've got a bunch of people all in favor saying aye, and they all say aye, and every one of them, despite the smiles on their faces, have got thoughts that are disagreeing with the intention that has been expressed. But groupthink has got that amazing capacity to offer up an example of apparent unison of opinion, whereas in fact there's a significant diversity. And that whole business of the importance of sharing accurate and thoughtful discussions of that is an important ingredient. And the final slide that I want to sort of spend some time with you is to look at the sorts of questions that we ask. What are the sorts of questions that we ask in order to seek further information? And what sort of questions do we ask to probe deeper? And just to give you, again, 30 seconds to have a little bit of a think about what are the sorts of questions that you ask in order to find further information. And my guess is that they tend to be of the order of how, what, where, when, and why. Those information questions. What happened? How did the criminal end up being shot? Where were you when this was taking place? What was the motivation that you had at that particular point? Precision questions are looking for a little bit more detail, and perhaps these are not things that people were thinking about coming up with. What exactly did so-and-so say? What exactly was the person doing when he was shot? How long was it before the rest of you arrived at the scene, and so on? Those sorts of precision to get in different type of data than the just the straightforward information. Inviting people to share the sorts of motivations that they have that led them to behaving in a particular sort of way. What stopped you from saying to Danny, no, I'm not going to shoot, despite what you're saying? What were you afraid of happening if you did? And, you know, possibly the thing that people are most fearful are their worst possible interpretations of possible events. Whereas in fact, they're the things that possibly happen or likely happen very, very rarely. So these reflective questions, the opportunity for people to be fairly immediately reflective about their experiences when they hear back what it is that they've just been saying. And sometimes that's an important component. Among the things that a colleague of mine who had the opportunity of talking to Donald Shern about his whole approach to reflective practice, he commented on the fact that he didn't know what he thought until he heard himself say it. And I think that that's what's behind this notion of the reflective question. The questioner hears something being said and they hear it back. The person who responds hears back their own response. And it might well be just slight nuances in the way in which that response is represented to them that make them think again, what am I saying here? I noticed somebody's talked about advocacy with inquiry, and that is quite clearly, in fact, the origins of, had its origins in action science. The whole approach to action science is, in fact, advocacy with inquiry. And for those of you who choose to have a go at this course at some point in the future, we'll be exploring that in considerably more detail than perhaps you might have come across it so far. So questions then to probe deeper, we're looking at things like clarifying. Are you saying that? I mean, I wonder how many times you hear yourself say, are you saying that such and such a thing? And what that clarification is doing is twofold. On the one hand, it's saying, is this what you said? And the other is this interpretation of what you've just said in any way inaccurate or misrepresenting? So those clarification type questions are extremely important, both for the questioner in terms of eliciting another response, but also for the person who's been questioned, who may revisit their thought processes by virtue of the fact that this is they are actually clarifying it. Understanding, where sometimes we might make assumptions about the way in which people have responded to the explanation, and that you might want to say, tell me a bit more about that, or can you explain that more? And sometimes we're a little bit resistant to doing that because it could appear to be that you're sort of undermining your confidence, in a sense, your self-confidence, by claiming not to understand. So offering insights or ideas, have you thought of such and such a thing? This might be an encouragement to think again about the way in which people have represented something, and digging deeper. What else has happened? What else was going on in your mind? What was going through your mind when this particular bit happened? And then looking at the layers, in a sense, as is represented here, looking for deeper interpretations. So Among the things that Action Science is encouraging people to do is to look for ways in which they can focus on data in a particular way by asking the sorts of questions that you see here on this slide, to enable people to gain further insight into their own thought processes as well as their words and actions. So in terms of what happens next as far as this webinar is concerned, is what I'd like to be able to do in moving towards brief opportunity for questions is to set up a small pilot group of a maximum of 6 people over the next month or so, perhaps starting in about 10 days, where we would spend a couple of sessions together in this small group of 7 or 8 of us. One of my colleagues may well be joining us for both of those sessions, where we introduce a little bit more of the theory behind action science and how it works. And then for the participants to engage in 2 workshops, each lasting 1 week, during which time they will explore quite explicitly some problematic events. And that would be followed by a brief Zoom collection where we revisited the whole process. So that's where we are from there. If you're interested in that process, what I need you to do is to be in touch with Andrew shortly after this webinar, and the first 6 people to say they'd like to join in the pilot scheme will be contacted by me. So thanks very much, Andrew. So back to you for the final wrap up. Thanks very much indeed.